Good evening. Chapter 7. This is a long chapter, a super important chapter. Just to recap, so far we had the encounter with the escaped convicts in the churchyard, and then later on the moors, a lot of drama, and then the nighttime chase with the soldiers. Following that, we saw the convicts sent back to the prison ship. And then we had a very short sort of chapter making sense of it all, reflecting, as it were, for Pip. And now we get a longer chapter, which, so today I was teaching beginning screenwriting, the last class of the semester, and a lot of what we were talking about was about rhythm and release of information. And I think, short, long is one of the simplest way you can control rhythm and release of information. Okay, so let's not waste any more time. It's 15 pages. It's going to be a long session. Let's jump right into chapter 7. At the time when I stood in the churchyard reading the family tombstones, so taking us back to the very opening, I had just enough learning to be able to spell them out. My construction, even of their simple meaning, was not very correct, for I read wife of the above as a complementary reference to my father's exaltation to a better world, that is heaven. And if any one of my deceased relations had been referred to as below, I have no doubt I should have formed the worst opinions of that member of the family, referring to hell. These lines actually remind me of Dickens's most famous opening, A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the summer of hope, it was the winter of despair. Because, as Roland Barthes would say, this heaven-hell comparison opens up the province, the symbolic province of antithesis. So the whole world rests between the two extremes of heaven and hell. Well, it's a very, very classic and simple way to open something, is to open up a vast territory and then narrow us into this vast territory, as we'll see from the rest of the paragraph. Neither were my notions of the theological positions to which my catechism, I've never understood this word fully, to be honest, bound me at all accurate, for I have a lively remembrance. That's a wonderful way of saying a strong memory. I have a lively remembrance that I supposed my declaration that I was to walk in the same all the days of my life laid me under an obligation always to go through the village from our house in one particular direction, and never to vary it by turning down the wheelwrights or up by the mill. So basically saying that, the walk in the same all the days of my life is a metaphor. But Pip, being a child, takes it literally, walk the same way every day in a particular direction. And I think obviously this is classic Dickensian humor, but it also sets up, in stories, growth is often, can you read? In the beginning, we all misread. And then when we achieve growth, we become better readers of the world. And so here, he's a misreader. That's what this whole paragraph is about. Pip has not had enough learning to correctly read the world. And the book is called Great Expectations. It's a classic coming-of-age story. So over the course of, we're only 9% of the way through the book. So in the next 91%, we presume he will go from this bad misreader into an excellent reader. So it's very humorous. It's setting up this province of antithesis, but it's also doing characterization and setting up Pip's arc. It's a really great paragraph. When I was old enough, I was to be apprenticed to Joe, and until I could assume that dignity, I was not to be what Mrs. Joe called Pompeyed, or, as I render it, pampered. So of course this is, making fun of her accent and dialect. Therefore, I was not only odd boy about the forge, but if any neighbor happened to want an extra boy to frighten birds, or pick up stones, or do any such job, I was favored with the employment. In order, however, that our superior position might not be compromised thereby, a money box was kept on the kitchen mantel shelf, into which it was publicly made known that all my earnings were dropped. Perhaps implying that if they thought Pip was making money for the household, people would find it tacky and would stop calling on Pip for those jobs. So they make it publicly known that all his earnings are being saved. We're not using this kid as child labor to supplement our family income. I have an impression that they were to be contributed eventually towards the liquidation of the national debt. But I know I had no hope of any personal participation in the treasure. Just a well-constructed Dickens joke. Mr. Wopsle's great aunt kept an evening school in the village. That is to say, she was a ridiculous old woman of limited means and unlimited infirmity, who used to go to sleep from 6 to 7 every evening in the society of youth, who paid 2 pence per week each for the improving opportunity of seeing her do it. So basically, she meant to be teaching them, but she was half asleep. She rented a small cottage and Mr. Wopsle had the room upstairs, where we students used to overhear him reading aloud in a most dignified and terrific manner. We remember from earlier chapters, he's a very loud guy. And occasionally bumping on the ceiling. There was a fiction that Mr. Wopsle examined the scholars once a quarter. What he did on those occasions was to turn up his cuffs, stick up his hair, and give us Mark Antony's oration over the body of Caesar. This is something that is close to my heart because in India, in school, we studied Julius Caesar for the ISC, my 11th and 12th grade, my board examinations. And of course I know this speech well. Brutus is an honorable man. This was always followed by Collins's Ode on the Passions, wherein I particularly venerated Mr. Wopsle as revenge, throwing his blood-stained sword in thunder down and taking the war-denouncing trumpet with a withering look. It was not with me then, as it was in later life, when I fell into the society of the passions and compared them with Collins and Wopsle, rather to the disadvantage of both gentlemen. So I'm guessing that Collins's Ode on the Passions is about gluttony and lust, and then later as Pip grows up, he realizes all this moralizing. He has a different relationship to it, as I think is the case for many of us. Mr. Wopsle's great aunt, besides keeping this educational institution, kept in the same room a little general shop. She had no idea what stock she had, or what the price of anything in it was, but there was a little greasy memorandum book kept in a drawer, which served as a catalogue of prices, and by this oracle, Biddy arranged all the shop transactions. Biddy was Mr. Wopsle's great aunt, I presume. Great aunt's granddaughter, okay. I confess myself quite unequal to the working out of the problem. What relation she was to Mr. Wopsle. She was an orphan like myself. like me, too, had been brought up by hand. She was most noticeable, I thought, in respect of her extremities, for her hair always wanted brushing. Her hands always wanted washing, and her shoes always wanted mending and pulling up at heel. Poor thing. This description must be received with a weekday limitation. On Sundays, she went to church. Elaborated. So I wonder if we'll see more of Biddy, the fellow orphan, in the coming chapters. Much of my unassisted self, and more by the help of Biddy than of Mr. Wopsle's great aunt. It's so hard for me to type Wopsle. Great aunt. I struggled through the alphabet as if it had been a bramble bush. Lovely image. Getting considerably worried and scratched by every letter. After that, I fell among those thieves, the 9 figures, who seemed every evening to do something new to disguise themselves and baffle recognition. But at last I began in a I'll have to find out what that means, in a purblind, groping way to read, write, and cipher on the very smallest scale. One night, I was sitting in the chimney corner. So this is a nice move from summary into scene. One night, very simple, clean. One night I was sitting in the chimney corner with my slate, expending great efforts on the production of a letter to Joe. I think it must have been a full year after our hunt upon the marshes. So time has moved forward in a major way. For it was a long time after, and it was winter, and a hard frost. With an alphabet on the hearth at my feet for reference, I contrived in an hour or two to print and smear this epistle. This is going to be tough to type. My dear Joe, I hope you are quite well. I hope I shall. So Scrivener is auto correcting these capitalizations. I shall soon be able for to teach you, Joe, and then we shall be so glad, and when I am prenticed, prenged to you, Joe, what larks. And believe me, infection. I have no idea what he means here. Pip. Believe me, information? Pip. So that's his letter to Joe. There was no indispensable necessity for my communicating with Joe by letter, inasmuch as he sat beside me, and we were alone. But I delivered this written communication, slate and all, with my own hand, and Joe received it as a miracle of erudition. I say, Pip, old chap, cried Joe, opening his blue eyes wide. What a scholar you are, ain't you? I should like to be, said I, glancing at the slate as he held it, with a misgiving that the writing was rather hilly. Why, here's a J, said Joe. And a O equal to anything. Here's a J and a O, Pip, and a J, O, Joe. Whew, that was harder to write than I thought it would be. So, Pip is pretty close to an autodidact, one might say. I had never heard Joe read aloud to any greater extent than this. Monosyllable. So you can basically, he's illiterate, he can only write his own name. Monosyllable. And I had observed at church last Sunday when I accidentally held our prayer book upside down that it seemed to suit his convenience quite well, as if it had been all right. So, wishing to embrace the present occasion of finding out whether in teaching Joe I should have to begin quite at the beginning, I said, "Ah, but read the rest, Joe." "The rest, eh, Pip?" said Joe, looking at it with a slow, searching eye. 1, 2, 3. Why, here's 3 J's and 3 O's and 3 J-Lo and 3 J-Los and 3 J-O Joes in it. Pip? I leaned over Joe and, with the aid of my forefinger, read him the whole letter. "Astonishing," said Joe when I had finished. "You are a scholar. How do you spell Gargery, Joe?" I asked him with a modest patronage. "I don't spell it at all." "But supposing you did?" "It can't be supposed." Not sure exactly what he means by that. Maybe sort of a joke about refuting hypotheticals. Though I'm uncommon fond of reading too. Are you, Joe? Uncommon. Give me said Joe, a good book or a good newspaper, and sit me down afore a good fire, and I ask no better. Lord, he continued, after rubbing his knees a little. When you do come to a J and a O and says you, here at last is a J-O, Joe. How interesting reading is. I derived from this that Joe's education, like steam, was yet in its infancy. Pursuing the subject, poor Joe can't get a break from Pip's questions. I inquired, "Didn't you ever go to school, Joe? When you were little as me?" When you were as little as me? Well, Pip, said Joe, taking up the poker and settling himself to his usual occupation. When he was thoughtful of slowly raking the fire between the lower bars. I'll tell you, my father, Pip, he were given to drink. And when he were overtook with drink, he hammered away at my mother, most unmerciful. It were the only hammering he did. Indeed, excepting at myself. And he hammered at me with a vigor only to be equaled by the vigor with which he didn't hammer at his anvil. You're a listening and understanding, Pip? Yes, Joe. Consequence, my mother and me, we ran away from my father several times. And then my mother, she'd go out to work. And she'd say, Joe, she'd say, now please God, you shall have some schooling, child. And she'd put me to school. But my father were that good in his heart that he couldn't abear to be without us. So he'd come with the most tremendous crowd and make such a row at the doors of the houses where we was that they used to be obliged to have no more to do with us and to give us up to him. And then he took us home and hammered us, which, you see, Pip, said Joe, pausing his meditative raking of the fire and looking at me, were a drawback on my learning. Certainly, poor Joe, though, mind you, Pip, said Joe, with a judicial touch or two of the poker on the top bar, rendering unto all their due, and maintaining equal justice betwixt man and man, my father were that good in his heart, don't you see? I didn't see, but I didn't say so. So I love this scene because Joe is so kind and so likable, and is sharing with the young boy his vulnerability. He's very open-hearted. He has a sense of humor, and so this is doing some exposition, what Joe's childhood was like. It's also doing characterization of Pip, because Pip fundamentally grew up in a loving household, even if he's an orphan, because this has been his father figure. Joe Gargery has modeled fatherhood so well. And also, Great Expectations is, as we'll find out across the next 800 pages, a long way to go, is a lot about fatherhood. And so this is a very, very important scene for how modeling, how to be a role model. So again, we don't have, at this time in England, there aren't battered women shelters. They didn't talk about domestic violence the way we talk about it now. So you see Dickens was very, very, you could say ahead of his time, but I just think attuned to humanity and very, very attuned, let's say. And we also see Pip's values. I didn't see, but I didn't say so. So he's discreet, but he does have opinions and beliefs. Well, Joe pursued, somebody must keep the pot a boiling, Pip, or the pot won't bile. Don't you know? I saw that and said so. So it's an idiom, somebody must keep the pot boiling or the pot won't boil. Consequence, my father didn't make objections to my going to work. So I went to work at my present calling, which were his too if he would have followed it. And I worked tolerable hard, I assure you, Pip. In time, I were able to keep him, and I kept him till he went off in a purple leptic fit. Probably an epileptic fit. Purple leptic fit. And it were my intentions to have had put upon his tombstone that whatsoever the failings on his part, remember, reader, he were that good in his heart. So there's something, it's been repeated 3 times. He was good in his heart. He was good in his heart. He was good in his heart. And obviously, he was a complicated man, but not that complicated. He didn't work and he beat the crap out of his son and his wife. But yet, Joe defends his father. And we will see this chiasmus, so rhyming concepts, later in the book. Joe recited this couplet with such manifest pride and careful perspicuity that I asked him if he had made it himself. I made it, said Joe, my own self. I made it in a moment. It was like striking out a horseshoe complete in a single blow. I love that, basically taking wordsmithing and and changing it into blacksmithing terms. I never was so much surprised in all my life. Couldn't credit my own Ed, to tell you the truth. Hardly believed it were my own Ed. Oops. As I was saying, Pip, it were my intentions to have had it cut over him, but poetry costs money. Cut it how you will. Small or large, and it were not done. I don't think that's true anymore. Poetry doesn't cost money, but funerals still cost money. Not to mention bearers. All the money that could be spared were wanted for my mother. She were in poor health and quite broke, poor thing. She weren't long of following, poor soul, and her share of peace come round at last. Joe's blue eyes turned a little watery. He rubbed first one of them and then the other in a most uncongenial and uncomfortable manner, with the round knob on the top of the poker. He's really quite vulnerable and open with Pip, which is such excellent modeling from a male role model father figure. Joe Gargery is the real hero of the first 7 chapters of this book. It were but lonesome then, said Joe, living here alone, and I got acquainted with your sister. Now, Pip. Joe looked firmly at me as if he knew I was not going to agree with him. Your sister is a fine figure of a woman. Great line coming up. I could not help looking at the fire in an obvious state of doubt. Even though she torments Pip, right? I think Pip is such a sweet boy. He doesn't come out and contradict Joe. He just looks at the fire in a state of doubt. Pip's reserve and not being a blabbermouth is such a good quality. Whatever family opinions, or whatever the world's opinions on that subject may be, Pip, your sister is. Joe tapped the top bar with the poker after every word following. A fine figure of a woman. I could think of nothing better to say than, I am glad you think so, Joe. So am I, returned Joe, catching me up. I am glad I think so, Pip. A little redness or a little matter of bone here or there, what does it signify to me? I sagaciously observed, if it didn't signify to him, to whom did it signify? Certainly, assented Joe. That's it. You're right, old chap. When I got acquainted with your sister, it were the talk how she was bringing you up by hand. Very kind of her too. All the folks said. And I said, along with all the folks, as to you, Joe pursued with a countenance expressive of seeing something very nasty indeed. If you could have been aware how small and flabby and mean you was, dear me, you'd have formed the most contemptible opinion of yourself. Not exactly relishing this, I said, never mind me, Joe. He's very self-effacing, our Pip. But I did mind you, Pip, he returned with tender simplicity. When I offered to your sister to keep company and to be asked in church at such times as she was willing and ready to come to the forge, I said to her, and bring the poor little child. God bless the poor little child, I said to your sister. There's room for him at the forge. It's nice to see again, like, Joe defends his spouse and his wife. I mean, Joe is very, very likable. I broke out crying and begging pardon and hugged Joe round the neck, who dropped the poker to hug me and to say, ever the best of friends, ain't us, Pip? Don't cry, old chap. hard to overstate how likable and what a positive male role model Joe Gargery is, raising his wife's younger brother. When this little interruption was over, Joe resumed. Well, you see, Pip, and here we are. That's about where it lights. Here we are. So, in terms of rhythm and release, we got a lot of exposition, but it's chapter 7, and we've had the emotional investment of the escaped convict and all that action come before. So, there's no need to front load all the exposition. You can wait until the reader is sufficiently invested. Here we are. Now, when you take me in hand in my learning, Pip, and I tell you beforehand, I am awful dull, most awful dull. Mrs. Joe mustn't see too much of what we're up to. It must be done, as I may say, on the sly. And why on the sly? I'll tell you why, Pip. He had taken up the poker again, without which I doubt if he could have proceeded in his demonstration. I do think giving a character an object over the course of a long scene is very effective and simple, like the poker in this case. Your sister is given to government. It's a good pun here. Given to government, Joe? I was startled, for I had some shadowy idea, and I am afraid I must add hope, that Joe had divorced her in favor of the Lords of Admiralty, how do I say that, or Treasury. That's funny. Given to government, said Joe. Which I mean to say, the government of you and myself. Oh. And she ain't over partial to having scholars on the premises. Joe continued. And in particular, would not be over partial to my being a scholar, for fear as I might rise like a sort of rebel, don't you see? This is why the powers that be don't want an educated populace, because they may rise. I was going to retort with an inquiry, and had got as far as why, when Joe stopped me. Stay a bit. I know what you're going to say. Pip, stay a bit. I don't deny that your sister comes the Mughal over us. That's interesting idiom, presumably because the Mughals ruled over India. So funny to see that come up here. I don't deny that your sister comes the Mughal over us now and again. I don't deny that she do throw us backfalls, and that she do drop down upon us heavy at such times as when your sister is on the rampage. Pip. Joe sank his voice to a whisper and glanced at the door. Candor compels Fur to admit that she is a buster. Joe pronounced this word as if it began with at least 12 capital B's. Why don't I rise? That were your observation when I broke it off. Pip? Yes, Joe. Well, said Joe, passing the poker into his left hand, that he might feel his whisker, and I had no hope of him whenever he took to that placid occupation. Your sister's a mastermind. A mastermind. What's that? I asked. In some hope of bringing him to a stand. But Joe was readier with his definition than I had expected, and completely stopped me by arguing circularly and answering with a fixed look. Her. Wow, she's got him totally beat. I love this. It's funny. It's so funny. It's really situational humor. You know, Mrs. Joe has Joe totally beat. And I ain't a mastermind. Joe resumed when he had unfixed his look and got back to his whisker. And last of all, Pip. And this, I want to say, very serious to you, old chap. I see so much in my poor mother of a woman drudging and slaving and breaking her honest heart and never getting no peace in her mortal days, that I'm dead afeard of going wrong in the way of not doing what's right by a woman. And I'd fur rather of the two go wrong the t'other way, and be a little ill-convenienced myself. I wish it was only me that got put out, Pip. I wish there warn't no tickler for you, old chap. I wish I could take it all on myself. But this is the up and down and straight on it, Pip. And I hope you'll overlook shortcomings. So what a remarkable person Joe is, you know. He's seen his mother suffer so much that he'd rather be out of balance in accommodating a woman than harming her. It's again really good modeling for young Pip and quite realistic, and he's very self-aware, and it's a chapter that really casts him in a good light. And I think we're past the halfway mark in this chapter. I know it's a long chapter. I think we've got another 5 pages, but it's a very important chapter because of what's to come. The first mention of the immortal Mrs. Havisham. Young as I was, I believe that I dated a new admiration of Joe from that night, as do we. We were equals afterwards, as we had been before. But afterwards, at quiet times, when I sat looking at Joe and thinking about him, I had a new sensation of feeling, conscious that I was looking up to Joe in my heart. What a lovely paragraph. It's really sincere and straight to the point. And sometimes we say that you should do showing, not telling. But I think a little bit of telling after a lot of showing can neatly contain a scene. However, said Joe, rising to replenish the fire, here's the Dutch clock, a-working himself up to being equal to strike 8. To strike 8 of 'em, and she's not come home yet. I hope Uncle Pumblechook's mare mayn't have set a forefoot on a piece of ice. Piece of ice and gone down. It is a hard frost after all. Mrs. Joe made occasional trips with Uncle Pumblechook on market days to assist him in buying such household stuffs and goods as required a woman's judgment. Uncle Pumblechook, being a bachelor and reposing no confidence in his domestic servant. This was market day, and Mrs. Joe was out on one of these expeditions. Joe made the fire and swept the hearth. And then we went to the door to listen for the chase cart. It was a dry, cold night, and the wind blew keenly, and the frost was white and hard. A man would die tonight of lying out on the marshes, I thought. And then I looked at the stars and considered how awful it would be for a man to turn his face up to them as he froze to death and see no help or pity in all the glittering multitude. I'm going to step away for a moment to get a tissue. "Here comes the mare," said Joe, ringing like a peal of bells. The sound of her iron shoes upon the hard road was quite musical as she came along at a much brisker trot than usual. We got a chair out, ready for Mrs. Joe's alighting, and stirred up the fire that they might see a bright window, and took a final survey of the kitchen that nothing might be out of its place. When we had completed these preparations, they drove up, wrapped to the eyes. Mrs. Joe was soon landed, and Uncle Pumblechook was soon down too, covering the mare with a cloth. And we were soon all in the kitchen, carrying so much cold air in with us that it seemed to drive all the heat out of the fire. One other advantage of giving Joe the poker is that the fire was constantly mentioned for 10 pages. Kind of every time the fire is mentioned, neurologically, the neurons in our brain fire, and we create this warm room. So every mention of the poker and the fire recreates this warm interior. So again, it does a dual function. It gives Joe a prop and gives him something to emote with through the whole scene, but it also keeps reestablishing the setting. "Now," said Mrs. Joe, unwrapping herself with haste and excitement, and throwing her bonnet back on her shoulders, where it hung by strings. If this boy ain't grateful this night, he never will be. So something's up for Pip. I looked as grateful as any boy possibly could. He's so sweet. Who was wholly uninformed why he ought to assume that expression. It's only to be hoped, said my sister, that he won't be pompied. So that's a callback to pampered. But I have my fears. She ain't in that line, Mum, said Mr. Pumblechook. She knows better. She? I looked at Joe, making the motion with my lips and eyebrows. She? Joe looked at me, making the motion with his lips and eyebrows. She? My sister, catching him in the act, he drew the back of his hand across his nose with his usual conciliatory air on such occasions, and looked at her. Well, said my sister, in her snappish way, what are you staring at? Is the house afire? Which some individual Joe politely hinted, mentioned she, and she is a she, I suppose, said my sister. So this is an enigma, right? The enigma is who is the she? And it's a very small enigma. I mean, they could have just arrived and said, Mrs. Havisham. But they're choosing to prolong and delay and dramatize this enigma. Why? Because this is important information. And by withholding important information for a smidgen longer, you increase its importance. It's what I was saying about rhythm, release, and suppression of information. Which some individual, Joe politely hinted mentioned she, and she is a she, I suppose, said my sister, unless you call Miss Havisham a he, and I doubt if even you'll go so far as that. Miss Havisham, uptown, said Joe. Is there any Miss Havisham downtown? Returned my sister. She wants this boy to go and play there. And, of course, he's going. and he had better play there, said my sister, shaking her head at me as an encouragement to be extremely light and sportive, or I'll work him. So it's funny, it's like, go play or I'll beat you. I had heard of Miss Havisham uptown. Everybody for miles round had heard of Miss Havisham uptown. So there's a lot of repetition. 5 minutes ago, we had no idea who she was. And now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 mentions in the next 5 paragraphs. So again, books teach us how to read them. And the book is teaching us this person is important. As an immensely rich and grim lady who lived in a large and dismal house, barricaded against robbers, and who led a life of seclusion. So a reclusive rich lady. Well, to be sure, said Joe, astounded. I wonder how she comes to know Pip. And now we get a great paragraph of exposition, but it's exposition doubled with characterization. And that's why I think in fiction, nothing should do only one thing. If something is only doing one thing of dramaturgical value, it could probably do something else. Noodle, cried my sister. Who said she knew him? Which some individual Joe again politely hinted, he's so petrified of his wife, mentioned that she wanted him to go and play there. And couldn't she ask Uncle Pumblechook if he knew of a boy to go and play there? Isn't it just barely possible that Uncle Pumblechook may be a tenant of hers, and that he may sometimes, we won't say quarterly or half-yearly, for that would be requiring too much of you, but sometimes go there to pay his rent? And couldn't she then ask Uncle Pumblechook if he knew of a boy to go and play there? And couldn't Uncle Pumblechook, being always considerate and thoughtful for us, though you may not think it, Joseph, in a tone of deepest reproach, as if he were the most callous of nephews. Then mention this boy standing prancing here, which I solemnly declare I was not doing. We believe you, Pip. That I have forever been a willing slave to. Good again, cried Uncle Pumblechook. Poor Pip. Well put. Prettily pointed. Good indeed. Now, Joseph, you know the case. So this is just really funny exposition delivered in a very voicey, rhetorical way. So it's just good writing in a great paragraph. No, Joseph, said my sister, still in a reproachful manner, while Joe apologetically drew the back of his hand across and across his nose. There's something very funny that I've learned so far just in this book about the repeat gesture. I think we do, as human beings, repeat gestures hoping for an outcome. So he keeps drawing the back of his hand across his nose, hoping she'll leave him alone. And the humor here comes from Dickens's observation of how humans behave. You do not yet, though you may not think it, know the case. You may consider that you do, but you do not. Joseph, for you do not know that Uncle Pumblechook, being sensible that for anything we can tell, this boy's fortune may be made by his going to Miss Havisham's, has offered to take him into town tonight in his own chaise cart, and to keep him tonight, and to take him with his own hands to Miss Havisham's tomorrow morning. Wow, so things have sped up. You know, in a matter of 2 pages, Pip is going from the only home he's ever known to Miss Havisham's tomorrow. So things have suddenly, rapidly sped up. So again, this is, I think, something to learn from Dickens. Slow fast, slow fast, slow fast. And Lord a mercy me, cried my sister, casting her bonnet in sudden desperation. Here I stand talking to mere mooncalves with Uncle Pumblechook waiting, and the mare catching cold at the door, and the boy grimed with crock and dirt from the hair of his head to the sole of his foot. With that, she pounced upon me like an eagle on a lamb, and my face was squeezed into wooden bowls in sinks. and my head was put under taps of water butts. So this is a speeding up of time now. And I was soaped and kneaded and toweled and thumped and harrowed. And I've learned this, Dickens has showed this stringing together strong verbs in an economical way of speeding up time. And harrowed and rasped until I was really quite beside myself. I may here remark that I suppose myself to be better acquainted than any living authority with the ridgy effect of a wedding ring. That's really good activation of touch, passing unsympathetically over the human countenance. When my ablutions were completed, I was put into clean linen of the stiffest character. So as you can tell, there's no question of Pip getting to say no. And I think that's one of the advantages of having a young protagonist, is they are in a low agency state. They don't have choice. So life just happens to them. And then in a coming of age story, over time, they develop more agency and choice. And they demonstrate their values through those choices. So it's why having a young protagonist is great, because you can put them in a matrix of circumstance and sort of boss them around the way Mrs. Joe is. I sort of did it a bit myself in Missy, although obviously I could have learned a lot from Dickens. Like a young penitent into sackcloth, and was trussed up in my tightest and fearfulest suit. I was then delivered over to Mr. Pumblechook, who formally received me as if he were the sheriff, and who let off upon me the speech that I knew he had been dying to make all along. Boy, be forever grateful to all friends, but especially unto them which brought you up by hand. And wow, the story is moving so fast. Goodbye Joe, the one figure who loves him and who is, well, his sister loves him too in a harder way. But Joe, we've just spent the whole chapter really underscoring Pip's connection to Joe. Goodbye Joe, but now that's gone. God bless you, Pip, old chap. I had never parted from him before. And what with my feelings, and what with soap suds, I could at first see no stars from the chaise cart, but they twinkled out one by one, without throwing any light on the questions. Why on earth was I going to play at Miss Havisham's? So this is the enigma being set up for the next chapter. And what on earth was I expected to play at? So a remarkable, remarkable chapter. Joe Gargery is such a wonderful male role model. The victim of DV, saw his mother being battered by his alcoholic father, took in his wife's younger brother, raised him and modeled a very thoughtful, vulnerable, kind, good-natured, good-humored masculinity. And Pip is so likable and self-effacing, and you can see Pip in Joe, and then we get the story just picks up where Miss Havisham appears. She's super important. She's super rich, and next thing we know, Pip is being literally carted off to do some God knows what odd boy services, and we'll find out in the next few chapters. But this has been, I think, technically one of the most rich and valuable sessions. It's been, an hour and a half, but immensely valuable. And to those who will watch this in the future, I hope you enjoyed it and got, anything out of it. I got a lot out of it. That's 7 chapters, approaching 100 pages. It's really been a great few weeks. Hope to catch you in the future. Thank you all, everyone. It's been a pleasure. I'll see you Thursday. Cheers.